I remember sitting in my car in the grocery store parking lot, engine still running, radio off, phone glowing a little too bright for how tired I felt. It was late, not dramatic late, just that end of day late where your brain is already half checked out. I hadn't even gone inside yet, but I already knew what I was going to buy. And more importantly, what I wasn't going to skip. There were things on my list, sure. Milk, something quick for dinner. But there were also a few extra things I hadn't written down anywhere. Stuff that felt expected. The kind of stuff that makes the week feel normal, comfortable, aligned. It wasn't about wanting those things. I didn't feel excited. I didn't feel indulgent. I just felt this low-level pressure, like if I didn't grab them now, something would feel slightly off later. Not wrong. Just off enough to bother me. I sat there longer than I needed to. Thumb hovering. Telling myself it was fine. Telling myself this was just how things worked now. And what I didn't notice, at least not yet, was how tired that quiet pressure had already made me. Somewhere along the way, normal got more expensive without anyone announcing it. There wasn't a meeting. Nobody sent an email. It just shifted. Going out to eat stopped being a treat and started being the default. Drinks weren't a once-in-a-while thing anymore. They were just what happened when people were together. Splitting apps, ordering one more round, grabbing dessert because everyone else was doing it. Each time, the number felt small enough not to think about. I'd tell myself I was being easygoing, flexible, low maintenance. I liked that version of myself. The guy who didn't make things awkward. The guy who didn't slow the group down by checking prices or hesitating. What I didn't realize at the time was how consistent it was. 3 dinners out a week, a couple casual lunches, a few, it's just $20 moments stacked together. When I finally looked at my statements months later, it wasn't shocking. It was worse than that. It was familiar. Rough math, nothing fancy, around $300 a month, just to stay in rhythm. Not luxury, not splurging, just keeping pace. And sitting with that number felt strange because nothing about those moments had felt important enough to cost that much. That's the part that stuck with me. How something so quiet could add up so loudly. There was a stretch where my calendar looked full, but my bank account didn't know why. Weekly lunches that weren't planned but somehow always happened. Group subscriptions that made sense because everyone chipped in. Shared plans where nobody was really in charge, so nobody ever stopped to ask if it still made sense. Well, the funny thing is, none of it felt irresponsible. No single moment felt like overspending. It just felt communal. Spread out. Like the cost didn't belong to anyone in particular. And that's where it got slippery. When money stopped feeling personal, it also stopped feeling real. The bill would come, we'd split it, and my part looked reasonable enough to ignore. 10 here, 15 there, 25 because someone added something last minute, and it was easier to just roll with it. What I didn't notice was how often I stayed quiet. Not because I agreed, but because speaking up felt heavier than paying. There's a strange math your brain does in those moments, a few dollars versus a moment of awkward silence. A mild hit to your account versus the risk of being that guy. I told myself I was choosing harmony. What I didn't say out loud was that I was buying it. For a long time, I told myself the numbers were too small to matter. That was my favorite line. Too small to stress over. Too small to calculate. Too small to change anything. It was always the same amount, too. About $20. Coffee, drinks, an extra delivery fee, a casual add-on that didn't feel like a decision. $20 barely registers emotionally. It's the kind of number you shrug at, but at some point I got curious, not motivated, just tired enough to wonder. $20 3 times a week. That didn't sound dramatic, but 3 times a week is about 12 times a month. That's roughly $240. Over a year, that's almost $3,000. I remember staring at that number longer than I expected to. Not because it ruined me, it didn't, but because I couldn't remember what I got for it. No single thing stood out. No memory felt worth that total. That was uncomfortable in a quiet way. Not panic. Just this low hum of embarrassment. Like realizing you've been paying rent on a place you barely visit. Some expenses don't feel like indulgences. They feel like corrections, adjustments, little upgrades to stay current. A slightly better phone plan so things load faster. A nicer seat because everyone else seemed to pick it. A closer apartment because the commute everyone talked about sounded miserable. None of it felt flashy. It all felt reasonable. That's what made it dangerous for me. I wasn't chasing luxury. I was chasing alignment. I didn't want to stand out by lagging behind. I wanted my setup to match the room. I told myself I was investing in convenience, in efficiency, in quality of life. And maybe I was, in small ways. But convenience has a subscription model. It shows up every month whether you notice it or not. There was a point where I realized I couldn't remember choosing these things. They just kind of happened. One small yes at a time. Each one defensible. Each one quiet. When I finally stepped back, it wasn't the total that bothered me. It was how automatic it all had become. Like my money was on autopilot and I wasn't in the cockpit anymore. I don't think social media made me want more stuff. That's not how it worked for me. It just made me uneasy. I'd scroll past pictures of dinners, trips, upgraded apartments, and I wouldn't feel jealous. I didn't want their life. I just didn't want to feel behind, out of sync, like I missed a memo everyone else got. That feeling is subtle. It doesn't scream at you. It just nudges. A little voice saying, "This is normal now. This is the pace. Keep up." So I adjusted. Not dramatically. Just enough to quiet that voice. I'd match the spending level I saw around me without really asking if it fit my actual life. What surprised me later was how exhausting that quiet adjustment was. Always calibrating. Always smoothing. Always checking my own choices against an invisible average. It didn't feel like pressure at the time. It felt like staying informed, staying current. But my bank account felt it differently. It felt stretched, tired, like it was carrying weight I never acknowledged. There's a phrase that shuts down a lot of internal conversations. Everyone's doing it. I leaned on that one a lot. It sounds comforting, reassuring, like proof that you're not making a mistake. If everyone's doing it, it must be fine. The problem is that phrase doesn't ask how much it costs you. It just asks how common it is. I realized later how often I borrowed confidence from the group instead of checking my own numbers. I didn't need to think if the decision was right for me, if it already felt socially approved. That safety came with a price, a quiet one, because once you stop checking in with yourself, the spending doesn't feel intentional anymore. It feels inevitable. I remember thinking I was being relaxed about money. What I was actually doing was outsourcing my decisions. And when the pressure finally showed up, I couldn't tell where it came from. It was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. The stress didn't arrive with a crisis. That's what confused me. Bills were paid. Nothing was late. I wasn't drowning. On paper, things looked fine. But there was this constant background tension I couldn't explain. A low-level tightness that never fully went away. I'd open my banking app and close it just as quickly. Not because I was scared, but because I didn't feel like sorting through it. It all blurred together. Charges I recognized. Charges I vaguely remembered. Nothing alarming, just a lot. It took me a while to realize that stress doesn't always come from danger. Sometimes it comes from commitment. Invisible commitments you didn't consciously agree to, but keep honoring anyway. That realization sat heavy, because it meant the problem wasn't a sudden mistake. It was a pattern, a long one, and I had helped build it quietly by saying yes without noticing how often I was doing it. Some costs are hard to cancel because they're tied to who you think you are, or who you want to be seen as. Gym memberships I barely used. Subscriptions connected to hobbies I didn't really practice anymore. Shared tools, platforms, access to things that felt like proof I was still in the game. Canceling those didn't feel like saving money. It felt like admitting something had changed. That maybe I wasn't that person anymore. Or maybe I never really was. So I kept them month after month. The amounts weren't huge. 30 here, 40 there. But together, they formed this quiet drain that I pretended not to see. What got me wasn't the waste. It was the realization that I was paying for an identity I wasn't actively living, and that money left my account whether I showed up or not. There's something oddly heavy about that. Paying rent on a version of yourself that mostly exists in theory. Timing pressure is its own kind of force. Plans come together fast. Trips, tickets, events. Someone books, someone sends a link, and suddenly there's a deadline. I noticed how often I agreed before checking anything, before looking at my calendar, before opening my account. It felt easier to commit first and figure it out later. Speed replaces consent in those moments. You don't pause long enough to ask how it fits. You just move with the group. Later, when the charge hit, I'd feel that familiar knot in my stomach. Not regret exactly, more like resignation. Of course this is happening. Of course it's another thing. What stuck with me was how normalized that stress became. Like it was just part of participating. I didn't question the pattern, I just absorbed it. At some point, saying no started to feel like a personal flaw, like I was being difficult or cheap or out of step. I didn't want to be the reason plans changed. I didn't want to explain myself. So I said yes, even when my gut hesitated. Money decisions started blending with self-worth in a way I didn't notice right away. Declining an invite felt like declining connection, and that felt heavier than a swipe. I told myself it was temporary, that I'd rebalance later, that this was just a busy phase. But busy phases have a way of becoming permanent if you never interrupt them. Looking back, what surprises me most is how expensive belonging became without me ever naming it that way. I thought I was being social. I didn't realize I was paying a membership fee. This is the part I didn't want to look at first. I spent a lot of time thinking my stress was a budgeting problem, that if I just tracked better, optimized more, found the right system, it would all smooth out, but the numbers kept behaving. It was my assumptions that didn't. I wasn't leaking money because I was careless. I was leaking it because I was accommodating, because I didn't want friction, because I mistook quiet agreement for neutrality. That was uncomfortable to admit. It meant spreadsheets weren't going to fix this. It meant the pressure wasn't internal. It was ambient, all around me. And I had been breathing it in without noticing. Once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. And that awareness didn't feel empowering right away. It just felt heavy. There's a brief relief that comes from shared spending, a moment where everything feels aligned. The check is split, the plan is locked in, nobody hesitates. That relief feels good for about 5 minutes. Then the charge settles in quietly, and the relief fades faster than you expect. You're left with the bill and a vague sense that something didn't quite land. I chased that calm for a while without realizing it, saying yes because it smoothed the moment, because it kept things moving. What I didn't account for was how predictable the cycle became. Relief, cost, tension, repeat, over and over. By the time I noticed, the pattern felt familiar enough to feel normal. And that's a strange place to live, where the stress doesn't spike, it just hums. I used to think financial boundaries were loud, that saying no would make things awkward, that people would notice. What I learned later was that most people are far too busy thinking about themselves. The reactions I feared rarely happened. When I finally slowed down or skipped something or didn't immediately agree, the world didn't crack open. Plans adjusted, or they didn't, and life moved on. That realization came with a mix of relief and regret. Relief that the fear was overblown. Regret for all the money I spent solving imaginary discomfort. I had built entire habits around reactions that mostly lived in my head. And that's an expensive place to decorate. There's a difference between wanting something and not wanting to stand out. I didn't always know which one I was feeling. They sound similar internally. Both feel like desire. Both come with urgency. But one leaves you satisfied, and the other just leaves you aligned. A lot of my purchases fell into the second category. They didn't excite me. They just prevented a feeling I didn't want. What surprised me was how little satisfaction followed. The item would arrive, the plan would happen, and within days it all blended into the background. The pressure, though, stuck around because it wasn't about the thing. It was about staying in place. Nothing I did felt extreme at the time. That's probably why it lasted so long. Moderation feels safe, reasonable. But moderation, when it's constant, still accumulates. Years passed like that. Small compromises stacked on top of each other. Each one justified. Each one forgettable. When I finally zoomed out, the picture wasn't dramatic. It was steady. A slow erosion that happened because I didn't want to stop and look. That realization didn't come with anger, just a heavy calm. Like realizing the road you're on has been gently sloping downward for a while. I can afford it is a dangerous sentence. I used it often. It's technically true most of the time, but it skips an important question. What else could that money have been doing? Affordability doesn't mean alignment. It just means the charge clears. I noticed how often I use that phrase to end the conversation with myself. No further thought needed. Decision made. Later, when things felt tight, I'd wonder why. And the answer was scattered across hundreds of moments where I stopped thinking too early. There was a quiet resentment that crept in over time, toward plans, toward expectations, toward the general pace of things. I didn't know who to aim it at. Friends weren't forcing me. Systems weren't obvious, so it turned inward. That's a strange feeling. Being annoyed at a situation you helped create. Complaining about a pressure you keep participating in. I didn't resolve that tension neatly. I still haven't. But noticing it changed, how it sat in my body. It stopped buzzing and started feeling clearer. Eventually, things slowed. Not because I planned it, just life shifting. Schedules changed, people moved, plans thinned out. What surprised me was how little actually fell apart. The connections didn't vanish. The world didn't punish me for missing a few things. The fear had been louder than the outcome. That realization came with relief, but also sadness. For all the energy I spent bracing for reactions that never arrived, for all the money I used as padding, there's a number that sticks with me now. A monthly amount I don't automatically spend anymore. It's not huge. It's not impressive. It's just there, quiet. What's strange is how empty that space feels sometimes. Like a room after the furniture's been moved out. Not bad, just unfamiliar. The pressure that used to live there hasn't rushed back to fill it. And I keep noticing that absence. I don't know what that space becomes yet. I just know it's there now. And for the first time in a while, it's not costing me anything.